Steve, we've known each other for a while through both of our work, and I've always enjoyed talking with you. But I'm especially happy to have you on the podcast today and really get to hear your story. Usually you're interviewing me, so this time I get to dig into your life a little bit, which I'm happy about.
Yeah, I'll try to not ask you any questions and to answer yours.
Yeah, well, I know that might be tough doing what you do, but that's okay. If there's something you want to know, we'll turn the tables a bit too. This will be fun. But let's start kind of at the beginning, as we do on the Gravity podcast, and share with me a little bit about kind of your early days, your childhood, where you're from, your family life, etc.
Sure. I've been listening to your podcast, and all your guests, your CEOs and entrepreneurs, have such fascinating childhoods and had life-defining moments. I don't really have that. I had a pretty, I don't want to say ordinary or normal, because it's really no such thing, but my parents were both teachers. They started out as teachers in high school, and my dad got his PhD in education and taught teachers. And my mom went from teaching to taking care of the three of us, myself and my two younger sisters, who I mostly ignored in childhood and now get along pretty good with. And then my mom went back and got her PhD at University of Penn and also became a college professor. So education was very important in our house. Reading was very important. So I think I read a lot as a kid, which perhaps influenced me to become a bit of a writer or want to become a writer.
Yeah, and so tell me a little bit about that. Obviously you've got a family that's committed to education. You're growing up in that environment. Kind of how old were you when you started to think about writing or start writing?
Well, it's interesting, and at least to me, it's interesting. In college, I went to American University in Washington, D.C., and my major wasn't journalism, it was communications. And I didn't really know what. I knew I had to go to college because that's what you did. And I didn't really know what career I wanted or what I wanted to study, but communications seemed like a broad enough area of study that I could figure something out. And I did. And college was, I think, for me at least, college was when I sort of discovered who I was a little bit and what I wanted to do, in the sense of not so much writing, but I just wanted to do something. It's like, I always admire people who know at an early age what they want to do. I had no idea. Mm-hmm. I had an internship in college at the USO. Remember the Hope USO? Mm-hmm. And an interesting story. One of the first things I wrote, it was Veterans Day, and I had to write a press release about Veterans Day. And I wrote this whole press release. We printed them out on the printer. I put them in the envelopes. I affixed all the addresses. This was really in the early days of computers, and you did it all by yourself. And this guy who worked there, a retired general, looks at it and he said, "Son, how do you spell veteran?" And I knew I was in trouble right then and there. And I looked at it, and I'm from Philadelphia. We pronounce it veteran. Mm-hmm. Right? And there was a stadium in Philadelphia, Veterans Memorial Stadium, but it's veterans. Right. I spelled it like it sounded, which is wrong. So I had to redo the whole thing. And I think I learned an important lesson there about spelling things correctly.
Yeah. So interesting. I'm kind of curious, to hear a little bit more, kind of backing up to, kind of what things were like for you as a kid and through high school. But it is interesting that you kind of, don't necessarily have the writing piece coming in that early. And I think that's important to highlight, because I think you said, you admire people that know what they want to do early, but I think that's kind of unique. In fact, I was at my doctor's office yesterday, and I was asking him what it's been like for him to operate in a pandemic. And he said, well, the truth is I've prepared my entire life for this. And he's got a big job at the hospital, and he's been involved with the governor's office, and he's got his own practice. And and he said, I remember being pretty young, and my teachers saying to me, maybe you consider going into medicine. And so there are those stories, those people, you hear them, and I think a lot of people, when they hear those stories, think like, well, what's wrong with me? Young people, or even people, as they kind of get into their careers, they say, why is it that I don't have some sort of passion, or I don't have clarity on what I should be doing with my life, or what I want to do with my work. And I actually think it's way more common than not. It's just not talked about as much. People are kind of, maybe embarrassed by that, So I'm glad you said that.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with not knowing what you want to do when you're 16, 17, or even 20 years old. And I remember from interviewing you that you started out in banking.
Yeah.
Eventually deciding that you wanted to do something different. But I think, at least for me, I didn't know how to do things. Like I had in the back of my mind, I wanted to be a writer, but how do you do that? And what kind of writing? As it turns out, journalism is very different from writing. A lot of people will say to me, I really like writing, so can I get a job at your newspaper? And, writing and journalism are very different, which took me a long time to learn.
Okay, so that's interesting too. I'd love to get into that, but let's just kind of put a bow on kind of the early parts. I am kind of curious, knowing that you didn't have a clarity on wanting to be a writer. You had this kind of family influence around education. Just tell me a little bit more about kind of like what you were like as a kid, what kinds of interests you did have, what maybe little threads, did end up kind of, starting to guide you, even if you didn't know it at the time.
I was very interested in sports, in watching them and playing them. I played all the sports and eventually settled on soccer. And that was a big part of my life in high school. I was a okay high school soccer player, a very mediocre college soccer player. What else did I do? I always had jobs, odd jobs. I would cut grass and shovel snow. And I worked at restaurants you had to be 21 to be a waiter in Pennsylvania back then because of liquor laws. So I was a busboy, a dishwasher, a pot washer at 2 or 3 different restaurants. So I always had that desire to work and have a little money. Got in a little bit of trouble, nothing significant other than that. Oh, that time we robbed a bank. One of your guests was talking about how he was influence of summer camp. I did go to a summer camp. Yeah. Our neighbors down the street actually owned a summer camp, and we were fairly middle class, and it would have been hard for my parents to afford it. So they cut us a break and gave us a discount. Although I was only a camper there one year, then I became a waiter and then a counselor. And camp was, I think, pretty significant for me for a couple of reasons. It's where I discovered girls for the first time. And you just got to play sports all day and hang out with your friends. And so I really enjoyed going to camp for about 5 or 6 years. And being a counselor was fun too, to sort of be in charge of a bunk and sort of get all your kids motivated to do what they're supposed to do and not get into trouble.
Okay, good. So you go away to school and kind of pick communications. Tell me a little bit kind of like, what starts to happen for you there? You mentioned, you had this sense that, you wanted to do something. Tell me a little bit more about kind of like what that was and how things started to unfold for you.
Well, it's like you decide, you start to be a junior or senior and you say, what am I going to do? Where am I going to live? I'm from Philadelphia, but going to school in Washington, D.C. So what am I going to do and where am I going to live and how am I going to make the living? So like I said, my degree was in communications and I had an internship at the USO, and the guy who was the director of public relations for the USO became a mentor, one of my first mentors. Really interesting guy who pushed me in certain ways. Like I would write something, a press release or a story for their newsletter, and I would show it to him, and he'd just look at it and shake his head, not tell me what was wrong with it, but just say, do it again. Mm-hmm. And he would do that 2 or 3 times so it met his approval. And he was always he wanted something creative and different, which really put that in my mind at an early age. And I always tried to do that as a newspaper reporter, which often got me in trouble. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so I graduated from college, and I had an opportunity to get a job with him, or my other thing eventually was with the American Helicopter Society, which sounds kind of strange. But in Washington, D.C., it's where all the national associations are. There's got to be 4 or 5 of them for your industry, for the construction industry. There's ones for nursing, doctors, everything. There's 5,000 or 6,000 of them. And the American Helicopter Society had an opening for the director of communications, which sounds kind of like a high-profile job, but really there was a staff of 4 people. I became the 4th person, and our office was in a 1-bedroom apartment. The bedroom was the executive director's office. The 2 other people were in sort of the living room, and I was in the corner by the bathroom. And that was our office. And the first week, I could sense there was something wrong. The other 2 people did not like the executive director and were very disrespectful to her, which was really shocking to me. I get to the office on my 2nd Monday, and the other 2 people had quit with no notice. They just left. And just the 2 of us to run this association, which turned out to be okay and fine. And I learned a lot about leadership and what makes a good boss and what makes a bad boss. And I also learned that I didn't love communications and PR, but what I loved in that job was we had a magazine called Vertiflight about, obviously, helicopters. Vertiflight means vertical flight. Mm-hmm. It's what helicopters do. And I love doing that. And that's sort of what pushed me toward journalism. And also by a fluke, I got a job freelancing for Soccer America magazine. I had a little bit of background as a soccer player and as an editor of a magazine. I think impressed them. So I became the Washington, D.C. correspondent for Soccer America. And then by great bit of luck, 2 or 3 months later, Washington, D.C. gets a professional team in the North American Soccer League. And I'm the Washington, D.C. correspondent. So I got to cover them and sort of learn a little bit about sports writing and what it entails. And I think that further pushed me to want to become a journalist. Initially, I wanted to be a sports writer, but it also introduced me to travel, which is a huge part of my life. In 1981, my 2nd year at the Helicopter Society, I got to go to the Paris Air Show, which is the world's biggest air show. They hold it every other year. And it was just my first time going overseas. I didn't know even though I took French in high school, I didn't really retain any of it. I didn't know what I was doing. And actually, my college girlfriend was spending the year studying in south of France, and I met her in Paris. That was part of the allure of going there. Mm-hmm. And we had been apart for several months, and people kept saying, oh, these long distance relationships will never work. And I said, oh, come on, you're kidding. This will work. We're really in love. But it didn't work. And I discovered that in Paris. Mm-hmm. I did discover I loved traveling. Mm-hmm. And I went back to the 83 Paris Air Show and traveled all around. Went to Munich, Amsterdam, London, and came back to work. And about that time decided, I don't really see a future doing what I'm doing. It was a good job. Mm-hmm. I liked what I was doing, but it's time to become a journalist. A sports reporter was my goal.
Okay.
And so I wound up going back to school at Columbia, has a 1-year master's degree program in journalism.
And you really tell me a little bit about that. Like, what was it that had you saying, like, I have to be a journalist, or I really, this is what I want to do now? You've had this experience, you've kind of seen different aspects of the working world, you've traveled, tell me, kind of, how did you decide this was it?
I think early on in my career at the Helicopter Society, probably you were too young to remember this, but an airplane took off from National Airport in DC, which is now Ronald Reagan Airport. And it was a snowy, icy winter day. And as soon as it took off, it plummeted into the Potomac River. And it was huge national and international news. And the U.S. Park Police helicopters came and rescued people from the airplane. It was like floating in the water. The helicopter came and rescued them. And working for the Helicopter Society, I said, I am going to interview these guys and do a story about this. And before that, it was really, the magazine was more technical stuff, like how do you build a better engine and things like that. But I wanted to take it in a way that was more interesting to a wider audience. So I got to interview these pilots, and I was just fascinated by it and got to write the story. And back then you had cassette tape recorders, and I had a horrible experience where midway through the interview, my battery in my cassette recorder died. So the second half of the interview was lost. And I had to remember and take my notes and call them back. And it's given me a lifelong fear of recording people. I like check constantly now. But I think that was the first time I really got to write a story that was my own. And then between that, and then I did another story where I flew down to Atlanta and went with the Georgia State Police helicopter unit going after marijuana growers. And they said, all right, we're going over to this one house because they're growing pot in the backyard. And this was back, of course, when it was illegal. And they go, watch this. And we're flying over and they go, watch this. The guys went in on the ground in the front door. And sure enough, two guys run out the back and hide in the shed. And we're watching them do it, the whole thing. And they just radio them and say, these guys are in the shed. And we just watched the police come over and arrest them. So,
yeah, I mean, I would imagine that, once you kind of make that commitment and you get into the work, and maybe this is just kind of the fantasy, and maybe this is the kind of sexy part of the job. And I'm kind of curious to hear, for you, what it's really like. But it seems like it would be really interesting, like all the time, like the level of curiosity that you have to have, the level of kind of intrigue and kind of exposure to so many different things, so many different people, so many different situations, experiences, to really be able to dig in deeply and get super curious with people, to, kind of investigate and to poke and prod and find the story and get the answers. It seems so fascinating and energizing, I would imagine, that once you kind of get in a couple of those situations, you're hooked. Is that what it was like for you?
Yeah, and I think you could have been a good journalist too, because doing this podcast, it's easy to see that you're interested in listening and learning about people's stories. To me, there's all different kinds of journalists. You could be a hardcore investigative reporter, or a beat reporter, or an environmental reporter, an education reporter. But for me, I was always interested in the people's stories. And I just always just drifted toward that. I'm just interested in learning about people, what makes them tick, what they've overcome, what their goals and dreams are. And so I always sort of tailored my writing toward that. In retrospect, and I've done a lot of magazine writing, and I think I'm better tailored toward that, where you have more time with one subject rather than newspaper reporting, where you're churning out an article or two a day. You write something, you go on to the next thing. It's breaking news. So I always lean toward people-related stories. Like I remember when I interviewed you, it was like I wasn't so much interested in the intricacies of how you built your gravity building. I was more interested in what made you tick.
Yeah. I appreciated that, because I was more interested in the same story. I find the kind of, the business side of things. It's really why the podcast that we're doing takes the format that it does, is that I'm not as interested in kind of like the ultimate success and kind of plugging what we're up to today. It's more about like, how did all of that come together? And the human experience, the journey, which I think is, just for me, very fascinating. I've never thought of myself as a journalist, but I do really like to get curious with people and hear about their stories and their journeys. I think it's helpful to hear, to learn, to kind of see yourself in other people, and just kind of be connected in this life. This journey is fun for me, and that's what you've been doing your whole career. And I'm curious, like, tell me a little early on, maybe in the kind of Philadelphia days or with the Dispatch, like. Tell me about some kind of standout stories or experiences or memories of kind of people or opportunities you had to write that really touched you.
Sure. And you just got me thinking about really what I liked about doing it. And I have this great story, which I'll tell you in a minute, about the Normandy with the U.S. Army Rangers who landed there on D-Day. But early in my career, I did become a bit of I was a sports writer at the Philadelphia Inquirer, covering high school sports all through the seasons. I covered football, basketball, baseball, but also track, cross-country track, indoor track, outdoor track, and meeting and interviewing probably 4,000 or 5,000 high school kids and coaches. You just learn about people. And this was in Philadelphia, so it was from inner city Philadelphia, public and private and Catholic schools, to the rich suburbs, to the not so rich suburbs, to the towns like Chester and Coatesville, old steel towns that were in desperate straits, and there was a lot of poverty. So you meet every kind of person. And I think this is what's great about journalists, and why journalists perhaps are a little more open-minded and accepting of people, is you just learn, or I learned early on, that all these kids are the same. I mean, well, I shouldn't say this, they're similar, not the same. Everyone's a little different, but similar in that they all wanted to do well. They all wanted to make someone proud. They all wanted to make someone in their lives. Everyone's like that, and everyone has a story. I really got to spend time talking to kids, sometimes their parents, their coaches, and it was just a tremendous learning experience, and to learn how to talk to different people and create a conversation and how to listen. So those are just great skills that I think journalists have that perhaps other people should. Listening is an underrated skill, and the better you can do it, perhaps we might all get along a little better.
Boy, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I've operated in a coaching program called Built to Lead. I think maybe I mentioned that when we talked. It was a big part of me forming my business, and I still use it today, and have helped others go through that process. And one of the very first thing, I think actually it was the very first thing we did in that program, was something called 7 Good Minutes, which is simply sitting across from somebody, looking them in the eye, and asking them questions for 7 minutes without responding to them with your own thoughts. And the like next level of that is trying not to think at all while they're talking and simply listen. And boy, I realized how hard that was, and how hard it is for people. I mean, the instinct to want to just talk and to say what you think is so prevalent. There's such a desire for people to have to be heard, but in order to be heard, somebody has to listen to you. I think you're right. It is a skill certainly you have to have as a journalist if you're really gonna hear the story and find what's really underneath that. And I am kind of intrigued by this part of you that was in the sports world. That sports was something that as a lot of kids and boys plays a role in our lives. It's part of kind of our societal programming, but it is what it is. And you got to see the stories that were really human stories. I find you can do this in any aspect of life, but sports is one of them, where there are a lot of really kind of deep stories beyond just the result of the game. And that sounds like you started to see that pretty early on too.
Yes, I saw it in the high school, covering the high school sports, but I also had an opportunity a couple years in. I got to do 2 sports books. The first one was a biography of John Chaney. I don't know if you remember or have heard of
I
him.
do. Yeah.
Coach at Temple University.
Yeah, sure. I remember him.
That was a fascinating year. He's an African-American man. He must be now in his early 80s. So that gives you a sense of the era he was in.
Yeah.
The second best basketball player in the city of Philadelphia in high school, but couldn't get a scholarship because just black players didn't get scholarships back then. Couldn't get coaching jobs because African Americans didn't get coaching jobs. Just took him forever to get to Temple, and was this amazing coach and advocate for education. I got to spend 2 years with him and his team and learn all about him and players on his team, and perhaps a little bit more about what it's like to grow up as an African American in this country and the obstacles you face and some of the families they come from and just all the ups and downs. And he was just such a powerful and passionate spokesperson for what he called leveling the playing field, the problem that we still are dealing with today in this country. So spending a year with him, 2 years with him and his team, was just a tremendous learning experience. And then I did a book with Randall Cunningham, Scrambling Quarterback, the original Scrambling Quarterback.
Sure.
And again, another great experience to learn what it was like to be really a celebrity. I mean, everywhere I went with him, he was mobbed. People knew him. And thank goodness there were no cell phones and selfies back then, or it would have been horrendous. But just to learn what it was like to be one of the 2 or 3 most famous football players in this country was just a fascinating experience.
I bet, both cases you've got African-American men in kind of pioneering, to some degree, leading roles. I mean, Randall Cunningham was like one of maybe Warren Moon. I'm trying to think of others, but he was certainly one of the first scrambling, running African-American quarterbacks. So I think he was probably the first that really kind of changed the position. And yeah, I mean, it was a big deal back then to be certainly up close and see that in person. Had to be pretty fascinating.
He was on the cover of Sports Illustrated, the ultimate weapon, they called him. Mm-hmm. We had a little problem. He got hurt right as the book came out. He broke his leg. He got hurt on a Sunday. That Tuesday, we were going to drive up to do the David Letterman show to promote the book. And I was going to go with him. I wasn't going to be on the show, but that was canceled. 10 signings were canceled. The book didn't do well. That's one of the things you learn with sports books is it's probably better to write about a retired athlete because they won't get hurt in the middle of the night.
Okay. So tell me a little bit, as you kind of come to Columbus and get involved with the Dispatch. And I'm curious, ultimately I want to hear about your cycling, your love for cycling, and kind of how that's led you to your work today. But, what brought you to Columbus, and tell me a little bit about all the years that you worked at the Dispatch.
So I actually first came to Columbus to teach journalism at Ohio State. It was 2006, and I was working at the Allentown Morning Call. And the handwriting was already on the wall that there was big changes in the newspaper industry. We'd already had, I think, 3 rounds of cuts at the Morning Call. We were owned by Tribune newspapers, a big national chain of 20 or so papers. And they kept having layoffs, and the bureau I worked at got closed, and I was going to have to move to another bureau. And the job I wanted as a general assignment reporter, they eliminated those jobs. So already in 2006, the contraction of the newspaper industry was starting. So I had looked for other options, and I taught at a couple colleges in the Philadelphia area. And so I took this job at Ohio State. I was the advisor to the Lantern, the school paper. Back then, not now, but back then it was a 5 days a week daily printed newspaper. And so I was the advisor to that and taught a couple classes, which I loved. I loved teaching and working with these young, passionate journalists. But I missed being a reporter a bit. And there was an opportunity at the Dispatch in 2008 to be a business reporter. I'd never been a specific business reporter before, but in theory, if you're a good reporter, you should be able to cover any beat. It's all the same. You interview, you gather information, you learn, you write your stories. And it worked out well. The editor and the assistant editor, Ron Carter and Barbara James, were great editors, two of the best editors I've ever had. And the Dispatch back then, had not been as affected as some of the other newspapers because it was privately owned by the Wolf family. And it had made money for years, but all of a sudden probably wasn't. But the Wolf family, you may know this more than me, were very involved in real estate.
Yeah.
And had a lot of income from real estate. So there wasn't as much pressure, I think, to make profit from the newspaper. So they held off longer than other papers in having cuts. Mm-hmm. But eventually there were cuts.
Yeah, I actually think, my understanding of it was that's probably true. I think their wealth had, been created in multiple ways. But I also think they really held on as long as they did because there was a deep sense of it being important to the city. And that there was something about that really mattered to them, that they couldn't really, just kind of let it go into, out of town conglomerate hands. And ultimately, it did. But I think, they really tried to kind of keep that local, pride gem, for as long as they could. I'm not certain about that, but I think, that's kind of part of it at least.
Oh, you're definitely right. John Wolfe, the publisher, cared very much about the city, and he really helped lead some of the big improvements in the city. And you're right, he did want there to be good quality journalism. Mm-hmm. Did fight the good fight as long as he could before he finally sold the paper in 2015. And
so, you go from kind of teaching into this, this beat, writing from a business standpoint, a new thing. I'm kind of curious, and this is maybe just my ignorance, but how does it work? Does stories get assigned to you? Do you have any say in kind of, which things you get to grab onto and run with? Or tell me a little bit about like the inside the paper, kind of dynamics. What's that like?
So within the business department, there would be different beats. Each reporter had a different beat, and mine was the financial beat, which include banks, insurance companies. So this was June and July of 2008. So what happened in June and July of 2008? The Great Recession.
Yeah, right.
And I was covering banks and insurance companies and financial stories. So I was in my head from the beginning and treaded water for the next 2 years, just trying to stay afloat and learn and keep up with all the breaking stories. So that's what I covered. And to answer your question, a good reporter tries to come up with story ideas on their own, good ones that you pitch to your editor, and that the editor says, "Yep, go do it."
Okay.
And you have a budget you create where you on the line where you'll write the stories that the editor can check, and you'll meet with them periodically, because you want to come up with your own story ideas, because the ones you come up with are always better than the ones the editors assign to you. Mm-hmm. Because all reporters, we have a bit of an ego, and we think our story ideas are better than the ones get assigned to you. Some of it's breaking news. When Huntington has their quarterly report in the midst of this Great Recession and has posted losses of 400, 500 million, that's today's story.
Right.
And then you learn from that. You say, what's the bigger story? Well, let me dig into unemployment and how it's impacting people. What are the stories I can write about specific people or groups of people and what they're doing, how they're coping with it? So you have breaking news, obvious things, and then you try to dig deeper and find trend stories or people stories or feature stories or investigative stories. And particularly back then, with all this going on in the economy, there was not a lack of stories to do. It could be 2, 3 a day, and you could be working on one. And then at 4:00, you get breaking news that the CEO of some big company was forced out.
Mm-hmm.
Got to finish one story and then write the other story and then get something on quick on the web and then get back to do your story for the daily paper. So,
Mm-hmm.
and it became harder and harder with less and less staff and more things that you had to do in terms of social media.
Yeah, it is a really fast kind of pace and changing climate. I mean, the amount of kind of change in the journalism world, from print to media to social media. I mean, it's really changed significantly over the last 10, 15 years. And yeah, that was a time that was certainly pretty wild for me too. And I can imagine what it was like. There was no shortage of stories. I mean, you didn't have to have somebody give you assignments. I mean, they were popping up left and right. And I've kind of one thing that I've learned through this pandemic that whether it's the tragedy of 9/11, the recession of the Great Recession of 08, 09, and now in this pandemic, is that every so often, every 5, 7, 10 years, something of tremendous magnitude, which was totally unexpected for the most part, and really kind of outside of my control. Really impacted not just me, my business, but the entire world, certainly the country, massive industries. And now it seems like I've kind of come to believe that is the only thing that you can really count on, that's going to happen every so often. And as a journalist, I wonder, as I told you about, my experience with my doctor, he said, I've been, kind of working my whole life for this. I'm preparing my whole life for this. That's kind of, I would imagine, part of what you are prepared for, that you're kind of, in some ways like waiting for and maybe even excited by, that there's these massive moments. Is that true?
Oh, definitely. All reporters live for the big story. Unfortunately, so many of them are tragedies.
Yeah.
And I was there in Philadelphia covering the 9/11, covering all the local stories, the recessions, big murders, and so much of it is tragedy. But yes, those are the things that get your adrenaline pumping. That's in many ways why you become a reporter, for the big stories.
Okay, Steve, tell me about cycling. Where did that come into your life? Because I know there's a lot of kind of major kind of impactful components of this for you. Certainly you've, as I said in the bio, been very active in Pelotonia, and you're now working closely with the James. Where did this start for you?
So back in 1985, I was covering the Paris Air Show for the third time, and I always took a couple weeks off because I was already over there, and the company had paid my airfare. Actually, by that time, I had just gotten out of journalism school at Columbia and lined up some freelance articles covering the Paris Air Show, paid for my trip, and I had these 2 weeks off, and I said, I've been to all the big cities by train. I want to get out in the country. So I took a train to the Loire Valley. And as I'm on the train, I read in my guidebook, Let's Go France, the best way to see this area is by bicycle. And it listed a place in the city I was going to rent a bike. So not having ridden a bike since high school, I rented one and rode around and was in tremendous pain, my rear end and my legs and everything, but loved it. I just loved the freedom, the adventure of it, just mapping it out and going, and just loved it. And in 1990, I kept riding, but in 1990, I took the summer. I was still covering high school sports, and there are no high school sports in the summer. So I saved my money and I went to France and rode from Paris to Nice. And then I was just totally hooked. And then went back in 92 and rode from Paris to Amsterdam, got married, shortly after that and somehow convinced my wife, who's not a cyclist and never was, that on our honeymoon, we're going to bike through France. And we survived that without getting divorced. So, and have learned how to combine our passion. She's still not a cyclist, but loves traveling. And, I think you may have met my wife. I just remembered that. Do you remember? I'm sure you do. Soon before Gravity opened, you had Lori Moffat come in and teach an urban Zen class.
Yes.
My wife is also an urban Zen teacher and went with Lori to help teach.
Yes, I do. I have met your wife. Yes, and I remember that event. Yeah.
So we're all connected in this world.
That's right.
So I just fell in love with cycling and still cycle to this day. And should we talk about the incident?
Yes, let's talk about it. You were in a really bad accident, and I'll let you tell the story.
So 2013, November, I had just gotten back from a trip to France cycling in the Loire. And I wrote my goal, back then I had started writing ebooks about traveling in France because I thought of myself, and I'm a little bit of an expert on it. So I wrote these ebooks. And I'd just gotten back from the Loire and was out for a ride. And it was a Sunday morning, 11 o'clock. And next thing I know, it's Wednesday and I'm waking up in the hospital. I had been hit from behind by a intoxicated hit and run driver. And it was pretty bad, very bad. I'm very lucky to be alive. There's people who get hit in that similar way where someone going at whatever the speed is, 40 miles an hour, just hit you from behind and gravity and physics fly you back into the windshield and then back over the car. And so it was really bad and life-changing. I had 15 or 18 broken bones, including a fractured skull and traumatic brain injury. And that traumatic brain injury is sort of the lingering injury that stays with you. And again, I was really lucky. I just lucked out in so many ways. I've met other people who've had traumatic brain injuries, and sort of the level you can go from 1 to 10. I'm sort of luckily at the bottom, in terms of severity, where it can be so severe that you lose your ability to communicate or walk. I just met a few people who they can't work anymore. They really are disabled. One woman I met, she was on the telephone and lightning struck, went through the telephone into her head, and she got a traumatic brain injury. Which is just shocking that those things can happen. Yeah. But that's ultimately why I left the dispatch. The traumatic brain injury changed me in a lot of ways. It's also what led me to some of the things we talked about, meditation and yoga, and just trying to alter you can change the chemistry of your brain through these things, which I'm trying to do. And with the help of my wife through Urban Zen, know these things. But I was able to go back to work at the dispatch part-time and then full-time. And my cognitive skills were about the same. My ability to gather information and write were the same. But there was a price to be paid. I was just exhausted all the time. I couldn't sleep. My stress and anxiety levels were up, which are symptoms of a traumatic brain injury. I was just more susceptible to sound and light. And so in June or July of 2015, I just decided it was just best for me to go the freelance route and left the dispatch, which was a tough decision. I mean, there's just something special about working for a newspaper, the people you work with and being part of that news cycle. So it was a very hard decision, but one I really had to make. And so I'm still dealing with some of the impact and life changes from the injuries and traumatic brain injury, but I am still a cyclist. I am able to ride and actually enjoy it. In some ways, it's a form of meditation for me to get out and just be quiet and listen to the wind.
Yeah, I want to kind of dive in with you on all of that. I appreciate you sharing because I get the magnitude of that experience, not fully because you can't without having experienced it directly, but I can sense it in you, just how scary and traumatic and life changing that was. And if you don't mind, I'd love to just kind of hear a little bit. Like, was it really like that? Like you actually, you're on your bike, and the next thing you know, you're in the hospital. Is that kind of the way that you remember this?
Yes, totally. The last thing I remember, I was near the on McHugh Road near that OSU golf course, and I parked there, and I'd stopped to get some water, and I texted a friend who was visiting from out of town, and I said, "Hey, I'm on my way home. I'll meet you at 1:00 for lunch." And that's literally the last thing I remember. And it was about half a mile or 3/4 of a mile when I got back on the road and was riding toward that pedestrian bridge to Whetstone Park that I got hit. And I do not remember a thing until waking up Wednesday. They tell me I was on a respirator, which I have no memory of. I was in some sort of semi-induced coma, but was thrashing about. And one friend told me about how worried they were that I was pulling things out, the IVs and things. And he had to like sit on me and yell at me to stop moving about. But I don't remember any of that. I don't remember anyone visiting me. My parents came in from Philadelphia. I don't really remember that first day or two of seeing them. That whole first month was pretty hazy between the brain injury and the pain-killing drugs they put you on.
Yeah.
And you're sort of just, I don't think I was fully aware of the seriousness of it and how close I had come to death for weeks or months later. And it was much harder for my wife than me. I mean, she's the one dealing with it more than me. And our niece, who was going to law school at the time, had just moved here like a month before, was my wife's partner in helping me and being our caregivers. And for them, I mean, I can't even imagine that call they get to come to the ICU at Riverside. Your husband's been in an accident. I just can't imagine that. And then come walking in and seeing me and having to deal with that. But I mean, knock on wood, thank goodness the call wasn't your husband's been killed. Because I know someone 4 or 5 months later, someone who I met, a cyclist, that happened to him. His name's Gian Papa, this same type of accident. And it's just devastating. I went to his memorial service, and I just remember seeing his wife there and thinking Susan could have been in this same position where my memorial service, which is heartbreaking to me that she had to go through that. So.
Yeah. It had to be tough for everybody. And, thank God you're here. And I love the fact that you have turned to meditation and yoga and other ways to heal. And maybe you can just kind of elaborate a little bit on that experience and kind of how that's been helpful for you as you're recovering still, from this accident.
Well, at the time of I don't like to call it an accident.
I actually was just thinking that it's an incident. I mean, when there's an intoxicated driver here, that's not an accident. You're right.
At the time, my wife was in the training for Urban Zen, and Urban Zen it's therapies and skills that can be used to help people in life. It's meditation, guided meditation, Reiki, aromatherapy, gentle yoga, and it's used to help reduce stress and anxiety. She does it with cancer patients, with other sorts of people who are overcoming injuries or illnesses. They do it a lot with people in high stress jobs. So it was perfect timing in a sense that all those modalities she practiced on me after my incident. She did a lot of guided meditation and Reiki and aromatherapy. And it's, as you know, it's almost, I equate it to writing and journalism. It's a craft almost, and that you need to learn and practice meditation. You're not going to be good at it at first. And I've gotten to the point now where I don't get frustrated at myself for not being good at it. I just realize, all right, just take your time, clear your thoughts, and do it. In fact, earlier today, there's a new show on Netflix called, I think it's called Guide to Meditation by Headspace. And it's almost like a class. And at the end, they do a guided meditation, which I did earlier today, and that helped me calm down before talking to you.
Yeah, yeah, it's so helpful. I practice transcendental meditation, and what they say is you always get what you need. And so if that means that you have a lot of thoughts, well, that's just you had a lot of thoughts. If you fall asleep, you needed to sleep. That there is no wrong. And I've kind of found that to be true for me, that kind of wherever you are, you can get a benefit. You don't have to be in some transcendental state for 20 minutes at a time or whatever to really get the benefits of meditation.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And any little bit helps. And one of the side effects for me with this traumatic brain injury is it's just so hard for me to shut my brain off. I think that's why I have problems with sleeping. Mm-hmm. So meditation really helps. It helps you in that moment, and it helps you throughout the day.
Yeah. Yeah. Steve, tell me a little bit about your work at the James. Let's kind of, as we start to wrap up, I want to make sure we connect with your work there. You've obviously been so involved with Pelotonia, not just as a rider, but as a supporter, as a journalist, as a fundraiser, and now you're working with the James, you have your podcast. Tell me a little bit about kind of that piece of your life.
Well, I have a bit of a cancer connection. Susan, my wife, was, when I first met her and for years after, a pediatric oncology nurse and also a breast cancer survivor. Mm. So cancer is something I'm familiar with. So getting the opportunity to be involved in Pelotonia and then working for the James has been tremendous because, cancer is just devastating, what it does to people. And we need to make this a cancer-free world. And I get to talk to, just like we're doing, with these amazing, passionate, intelligent, dedicated, world-class doctors and scientists at the James who really are saving lives every day. And I get to learn about immunotherapy and about this new proton radiation beams that they're going to have to treat patients. And I've gotten to know these doctors, and they're just so inspiring and so dedicated and so smart and so nice. There's this culture of niceness at the James and connection to the patients. And I know I'm sounding like I'm doing PR for them, but it's so true. And everyone who's been there, I think, says the same thing. And this connection between the James and Pelotonia, I think, are you part of Pelotonia?
Yeah. Yeah.
So to ride with these doctors and all these people together is this most inspiring thing of the year for me. And to not be able to do it this past year was a bit devastating. I always say that in this world in which we're so divided, Pelotonia is this like oasis of kindness that brings us together. Everyone's there to help other people, which isn't that the best thing we can do?
It sure is. It sure is. And I'm happy to have you on today. I have always felt that the journalists in this community have been very kind to me for the most part, and have taken a sincere interest in my life and in my work. And I've developed really great relationships as a result. When people talk about the journey, part of the journey for me is these memories of spending time with people and sharing your story and having them get it, understand it, write about it, capture it. It's been impactful for me personally, with my family, with my business, to grow a business here. And you've been a part of that on multiple occasions. And there's been others, Katie Smith and Jim Weicker and Christy Eckert and, others. And so, it's fun to really, get a chance to honor you and your story, because you do have such a passion for the work and a passion for this community and a passion for cycling, a passion for Pelotonia and the James. And I just, see a lot of passion and a lot of joy and human beings and experiencing life and doing good for others in this community. And so, I just wanted to, thank you for your collaboration and friendship and your time to share your story today.
Well, thank you. I was a little nervous about doing this, about being on the other side of the microphone, but made it easy. And it was a lot of fun to, I guess, be the one telling my story rather than someone else's.
Yeah. Yeah, good. Well, any final thoughts, anything else you want to share with the audience before we wrap up?
Well, it's literally noon on Wednesday, January 20th. We're about to have a new president. So let's just hope that we can all come together, be nicer, and deal with the problems that are going on in this country.
Yeah, amen. I'm incredibly hopeful today, and believe that the future is bright. So, all right, Steve, thanks again. I appreciate your time and your story and all that you're doing. And we'll make sure to connect our audience to where to find you and continue the dialogue. Take care.
Thanks. Be safe.